"Sign it," her father said, "or we lose everything your mother is buried under." Amelia's hand was shaking, not from fear, from fury. The marriage paper sat in front of her like a verdict no jury had bothered to read. Silas Boone, a man she had never spoken to. A mountain hermit with a worn saddle and a face that gave away nothing. She picked up the pen. She signed. And the moment the ink dried, she looked across that cold church at the stranger she had just married and made him one silent promise. She would never be a woman who simply endured. She had no idea he was counting on exactly that. If this kind of story speaks to something deep inside you, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that notification bell, and follow Amelia's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Amelia Carter had planned her life down to the last careful detail. She would run her father's ranch alongside him until the debts were paid. She would expand the cattle operation into the northern pastures come spring. She would never, not for any reason under the Montana sky, let a man make her decisions for her. That was before the winter of 1885 broke the Carter family's back. 3 months of ice storms had killed 40 head of cattle. The creek that fed the south pasture had frozen solid for 6 weeks, destroying the winter crop. 2 of their hired hands had quit without warning, and the bank in Redstone Valley had sent its 3rd notice in as many months. A letter so polite and so cold, it might as well have been a death sentence written in ink. Hector Carter sat at the head of the breakfast table that Tuesday morning, like a man already buried. His hands were rough from 40 years of ranching. His eyes were tired in a way that sleep could no longer fix. And when he looked at his eldest daughter across the table, Amelia saw something she had never seen in her father's face before. Shame. "Amelia," he started. "Don't," she said. She hadn't even looked up from her coffee yet. "You don't know what I'm about to say. You've got that letter from the bank sitting face down under your left hand," she said, "and you've been staring at the door since before sunup. I know exactly what you're about to say." Her younger sister, Ruth, sat quietly at the far end of the table, pretending to eat her biscuit. Ruth was 18 and soft-spoken, and had learned long ago that when Amelia and their father circled each other in conversation, the wisest thing to do was become invisible. Hector turned the letter over slowly. He slid it across the table. Amelia picked it up. She read it once. Then she set it down flat and pressed her palm on top of it, as if she could hold the words still before they spread any further. "How much time do we have?" she asked. 30 days before they move on the property." "And the northern cattle?" 42 head left. Not enough to cover a quarter of what we owe." Amelia was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant she was thinking, not surrendering. "Then we sell the horses. We approached the Donnelly brothers about a short-term lease on the east pasture. We cut the household staff to just May, and we get through the spring on—" "It won't be enough." Hector said it gently, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted it. "I've already done those numbers, Amelia, 3 times. It won't be enough." She looked at him. He looked back. "Silas Boone came to see me yesterday," Hector said. The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Silas Boone was known in Redstone Valley the way a strange weather pattern is known. People were aware of him, vaguely unsettled by him, and mostly content to leave him to himself. He lived somewhere up in the hills beyond the tree line, came down to town maybe once a month for supplies, spoke to almost no one, and had no family that anyone knew of. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean and dark-eyed and serious, and he carried himself with the particular quiet of a man who had decided long ago that other people's opinions were not worth the air it took to argue against them. He was also, by every visible measure, poor as creek mud. "Silas Boone," Amelia repeated. "He's offering to clear the banknote entirely," Hector said. "All of it. In exchange—" "No. Amelia, I said no!" She stood up from the table. "I don't know where a man like Silas Boone gets the kind of money to clear a debt that size, and I don't want to know. And I am not going to sit here and let you tell me that you're trading your daughter to a mountain hermit because you can't figure out how to save your own ranch." The word hermit came out harder than she meant it to. Ruth flinched. Hector's jaw tightened. "He's offering an honest arrangement," her father said, his voice low and careful. "A legal marriage. He's not asking for anything improper. He says he'll give you your own space, your own—" "Stop!" Amelia turned away from the table. She walked to the window and stood with her back to both of them. Outside, the mountains rose cold and white in the distance, and the morning was gray and still. "You already said yes to him, didn't you?" Silence. "Didn't you?" "I told him I'd speak to you first." "But you already decided." Another silence. Longer this time. "Amelia." Her father's voice broke slightly at the edges, and that, more than the letter, more than the numbers, more than anything, was what turned her around. Because in 40 years of hard living, she had never once heard Hector Carter's voice break. "I have nothing left to give this family except this ranch. If we lose it, your mother's buried on this land. Your grandfather built this house with his own hands. Everything we are is in this soil." He paused. "I am not asking you because I have options left. I am asking you because you are the strongest person I have ever known, and I have run out of road." Amelia stood very still. Ruth was crying quietly at the table. She wasn't trying to hide it anymore. The clock on the mantel ticked and ticked. "Tell me about the arrangement," Amelia said finally. She didn't turn around. "Every detail. Don't leave anything out." Hector laid it out plainly, the way a man lays out bad news when he's too tired to dress it up. Silas Boone had come to the ranch the previous afternoon, hitched his horse at the post, knocked twice, and walked in like a man who had decided something and wasn't interested in being talked out of it. He had sat across from Hector at this same table, had spoken for roughly 10 minutes without raising his voice or shifting in his seat, and had laid out the following terms. He would pay the outstanding banknote in full, $1,400, within 48 hours of a signed marriage agreement. He would provide a home for Amelia in the mountains. He would not interfere with her relationship with her family. He was not, he said, looking for a servant or a pretty face to hang on his arm at socials. He was looking for a wife in the legal sense, a partner in the practical sense. And beyond that, he had no interest in forcing anything on anyone.
"He actually said that?" Amelia asked. "Those words exactly?"
"More or less," Hector said. "He said you'd have your own room and your own time, and nobody would force you to pretend at anything you didn't mean." Amelia finally turned back from the window. She pulled out her chair and sat down again. She looked at her father for a long time. "Why us?" she asked. "Why this family? Why now?" Hector spread his hands. "I asked him the same thing." "And?" "He said he needed a wife for reasons of his own, and that the Carter family had a reputation for honest work and straight dealing, and that he'd rather have an honest wife from a family in trouble than a willing one from a family with nothing to lose." "That's a very strange thing to say." "He's a very strange man." Amelia drummed her fingers once on the table. Then she stopped. "Friday," she said. "He asked for Friday." 3 days. She laughed, but there was no warmth in it. 3 days to decide whether to marry a man I have spoken to exactly never. You've seen him in town. I've seen him in town the way you see weather coming, from a distance, with the understanding that it's going to be unpleasant. She rode into Redstone Valley the next morning before anyone else in the house was awake. She told herself she was going to the feed store. She told herself she needed to speak with Thomas Aldridge about a potential sale on the bay mare. She told herself she was not riding into town to look for Silas Boone. She found him at the edge of the general store's side lot, loading a crate of supplies onto the back of a worn buckboard. He worked with a focus and economy of movement that reminded her, irritatingly, of the way her grandfather used to work. No wasted motion, no performance, just the task. She pulled up and sat on her horse and looked down at him. He glanced up once, then he went back to loading. "You're Silas Boone," she said. "I know who I am." "I'm Amelia Carter." "I know who you are, too." He lifted another crate. She waited. "My father told me about your offer," she said. "I assumed he would." "I'd like to hear it from you directly." He set the crate down and looked up at her then, properly. He had dark eyes and a face that had seen more sun and weather than indoor comfort, and there was something about the directness of his gaze that she hadn't expected. Not hostile, not warm, simply present. Like a man who had learned to look at things clearly because he couldn't afford not to. "What part of it," he said, "do you want to hear from me directly?" "The part where you tell me why a man like you needs to buy a wife." Something shifted in his expression. Not offense exactly, more like recognition. As if he'd expected the question and had decided some time ago how he was going to answer it. "I'm not buying a wife," he said. "I'm paying a debt to clear a burden that's about to destroy a decent family. The marriage is a separate matter." "You see a distinction there?" "Don't you?" She stared at him. He looked back. "What do you actually want from this?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The buckboard horse shifted its weight. A dog barked somewhere down the street. "A legal partner," he said at last. "Someone to stand beside me when it counts. I've got reasons for needing that right now. Reasons I'm not going to explain in a side lot with a dog barking down the road." He picked up the last crate. "You ride out to the property. You see the place. You still want nothing to do with it? That's your right. But at least come look before you decide." Amelia studied him for a long moment. "What property?" she asked. "Everyone in this valley knows you live in a one-room cabin in the hills." For the first time, the corner of his mouth moved. "Everyone in this valley," Silas Boone said, "knows what I let them know." He climbed onto the buckboard, picked up the reins, and drove away without another word. And Amelia sat on her horse in the empty lot and felt something she absolutely did not want to feel right then. Curious. She did not ride out to see the property. She told herself she was too busy. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she had already made up her mind. Thursday morning she woke up before dawn and saddled her horse. She followed the directions Silas had left with her father, a folded piece of paper with nothing on it but a hand-drawn route and the words, "Come alone, come in daylight." She rode north out of the valley, up into the foothills, along a creek that cut through stands of pine and aspen, and then higher still along a switchback trail that most people in Redstone Valley didn't know existed. An hour and a half of riding. And then she came around a bend and saw a cabin. It was exactly as described. Small, weathered, practical. One room with a covered porch and a wood pile stacked high against the east wall, and a water barrel, and nothing that suggested anything more than the life of a man who had stripped his existence down to what he needed and thrown away the rest. Silas was sitting on the porch step with a tin cup of coffee. "You came," he said. "I came to tell you no," she said. "All right." He took a sip of coffee. "You want to come in out of the wind while you do it?" He made her coffee without asking if she wanted it. He put it in front of her on the wooden table and sat across from her and waited. She wrapped both hands around the cup. She had not planned to stay more than 10 minutes. "I want to understand," she said carefully, "what you expect this marriage to look like." "I told your father." "I want to hear it from you, again, directly." He looked at her, steady, unhurried. "You have your room, your time. I don't need conversation if you don't want to give it. I need someone who can hold their own on this land, and who won't run when things get difficult." "Get difficult? How?" "That," he said, "is a longer conversation." "I have time." He turned his tin cup slowly between his palms. "There are people who have an interest in this land," he said. "People with money and lawyers, and the kind of patience that comes from knowing they can wait you out. A married man with a wife who's a known figure in this valley is harder to come after than a solitary man who nobody can account for." He paused. "The marriage isn't about affection. It's about standing. You need me to be a shield. I need you to be a partner. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes," he said. "A shield you put in front of you, and you go on doing what you were doing. A partner stands on equal ground." He looked at her evenly. "I'm offering you equal ground." Something about the flatness of his delivery made it more convincing than any amount of charm could have. He wasn't trying to sell her anything. He was simply stating a position and waiting to see if she'd meet it. "The cabin," she said. "This is actually where we'd live?" "To start." "What does that mean, to start?" "It means there's more to this property than what you rode through to get here," he said. "But I don't show people things I'm not certain of yet." "You're not certain of me?" "Not yet." She should have found that insulting. Instead, she found it remarkably honest. "What would it take," she asked slowly, "for you to get certain?" He picked up his cup, took a sip. "Marry me Friday," he said. "Come out here and put in the work, and don't quit the first time it gets hard. I'll get certain fast enough." Amelia looked at him across that small wooden table in that small weathered cabin, and understood with a sudden and uncomfortable clarity that the worst part of this situation was not that Silas Boone was a bad man. It was that he was a deeply unknowable one, and she had never been good at leaving questions unanswered. "If I say yes," she said, "and I find out later that you've been dishonest with me about any of this, I will not stay quiet about it. I will not be gracious. I will not pretend to be fine." "I'd expect nothing less," he said. She stood up. "I'll be at the church Friday morning," she said. "Don't be late." The wedding lasted 20 minutes. Her father stood at her left side. Ruth stood at her right, crying quietly into a handkerchief. The preacher was brief and kind. 4 other people were present: the church organist, the county clerk, old May from the Carter household, and a man none of them recognized who stood at the back of the room and watched without expression until the moment the papers were signed, then quietly left. Amelia had asked Silas who the man was. "Business associate," Silas had said. "You have business associates?" "More than people think." She had looked at him then, really looked at him in a way she hadn't let herself in the side lot or in the cabin, and she noticed something she hadn't registered before. His suit was old, but it was well cut. His boots were worn, but they were expensive leather, the kind that cost more than a month of wages for most men in this valley. And his hands, calloused, yes, from real work, but his nails were clean and his knuckles were straight, and those were not the hands of a man who had been poor his whole life. They were the hands of a man who had chosen to appear poor. She filed that thought away. The ceremony ended. Silas put a plain gold band on her finger. She looked at it for a moment and thought, I have either just saved my family, or I have made the worst decision of my life. And there is no way to know which one yet. Ready? Silas said. No, she said. That's honest. You said you respected that. I do. He held out his arm, exactly as formally as if they had known each other for years. Let's go anyway. So they rode north together into the hills, and neither of them spoke for the first hour. Which was fine, Amelia told herself. She didn't need conversation. She had brought 2 bags and her good saddle and a small box with her mother's things in it, and she was going to treat this the way she treated everything else that was difficult, with her chin up and her eyes forward, and no wasted energy on fear. But when Silas turned off the main trail she knew and began riding along a route she had not ridden before, deeper into the hills, past the tree line, through a stretch of pine forest where the shadows came down thick and the air turned cold and sharp, she felt the first real flicker of something she didn't want to name. This isn't the way to the cabin, she said. We're not going to the cabin tonight. She pulled her horse up slightly. What do you mean we're not going to the cabin? I said there was more to this property than what you rode through the first time. He glanced back at her over his shoulder, and there was something almost careful in his expression. I told you I'd need to be certain before I showed you. I've had a day to think. I've decided to be certain. Based on one conversation and a 20-minute wedding. Based on the fact that you rode out to a stranger's cabin alone in the morning and looked him in the eye and told him you'd come to say no, Silas said. That told me more about who you are than most people show in a year. She didn't have an answer for that. They rode on. The trail wound higher through the hills, and the pines gave way to open ridge, and the wind cut clean and cold across the elevation. And Amelia's heart was doing something she couldn't quite control, because something about the way Silas rode, not looking back, not checking on her, simply assuming she'd keep up, was simultaneously infuriating and deeply reassuring. And then they came around the long ridge, and she saw it. The trail dropped down through a natural pass in the rock, and on the other side of that pass, the land opened up into a valley she had never known existed. A wide, sheltered bowl of land pressed between 2 ridges, private and enormous, with good grass and good water and a creek running clear through the center. And at the far end of that valley, set back into the hillside with the mountain rising dark and solid behind it, a house. Not a cabin, a house. 2 full stories, stone foundation, wide covered porch, windows that caught the last light of the afternoon and threw it back in pale gold. A barn to the east, properly built, with a corral and what looked like 20, no, 30. No, she was still counting. Horses moving in the field below. Amelia stopped her horse completely. She sat there and stared. And she heard Silas rein in beside her. And she turned to look at him, and he was watching her face with the same steady, unhurried attention he'd shown from the first moment she'd spoken to him. And she felt something shift inside her. Some assumption she'd been carrying since her father first said his name, quietly, irrevocably, turned to ash. "You've been living in that cabin," she said slowly, "when I needed to. But this," she gestured at the house, the valley, all of it, "has always been here. Who knows about this?" "Not many people." "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because the wrong people knowing about it," he said, "is how I lose it." She turned back to look at the house in the last of the afternoon light. Her mind was running through everything: the worn buckboard, the patched saddle, the way men in town looked at him with a quiet unease that she had read as wariness of a poor man's pride, but which she understood now, reframing fast, might have been something else entirely.
Silas, she said carefully.
Yeah? Exactly how much are you worth? He was quiet for a moment. More than the banknote I cleared this morning, he said. And before she could find the right response to that, before she could sort out whether she was more furious or more astonished, he clicked to his horse and rode down into the valley toward that impossible house, and left her sitting on the ridge with the wind in her face and the entire shape of her new life suddenly unrecognizable. She sat there for 10 full seconds. Then she followed, because she was Amelia Carter, and she had never yet let a question ride further than her. The front door opened without a key. That was the first thing Amelia noticed. Silas simply pushed it, and it swung inward, and she understood immediately that this was a man who was not afraid of someone finding this place, or who had made absolutely certain no one ever would. The inside of the house was not what she expected either. It was not the showpiece of a wealthy man who wanted to be seen. It was lived in. Quietly, carefully, deliberately lived in. There were books on the shelves, real ones, stacked too deep and sorted by no system she could immediately identify. There was a long oak table in the main room, solid enough to seat 8, with 2 chairs pulled close together at one end, and the rest pushed back as if they were rarely used. A stone fireplace took up most of the north wall, and someone, Silas presumably, had laid a fire already, so the room was warm when they walked in, which meant he'd been planning to bring her here before he told her he'd decided to be certain. He had been certain before he said he was. She filed that away, too. "Your room is upstairs," he said, moving toward the staircase without ceremony. "Second door on the right. It's got its own lock, and I don't have a key to it. I had the lock changed before the wedding." She stopped walking. "You had the lock changed before the wedding," he repeated, and looked back at her with that same level gaze. "I told you, I'm not interested in forcing anything. You planned this whole thing down to a door lock, and you're telling me you decided to be certain based on a morning conversation?" "I decided the lock before the conversation," he said. "I decided to bring you here tonight based on the conversation. Those are 2 different decisions." She stood in the middle of that warm, book-filled room and looked at him, and the thought that passed through her mind was both clear and profoundly uncomfortable. This man is smarter than anyone in Redstone Valley has given him credit for, including me. "I want to know," she said carefully. "Everything. Not tonight, but soon. I want to know how much land, how much money, why you've been living like a man with nothing, and who those riders are that people say come looking for you. I want all of it." "You'll get all of it," Silas said, "when it's the right time." "That is an unsatisfying answer." "I know, but it's an honest one." He moved toward the kitchen. "You hungry? I've got venison stew on the back burner. Been slow cooking since this morning." She blinked. "You cooked," she said flatly. "I live alone. I learned." He didn't look at her. "Sit down, Amelia. It's been a long day." It had been, she realized. The longest day she had lived in some time. And the smell coming from the back of that kitchen was, against all her current emotional objections, extraordinarily good. She sat down at the long oak table, and Silas Boone, the man she'd married 6 hours ago, set a bowl of venison stew in front of her without fanfare, pulled the other close chair around, and sat down across from her like they'd been doing this for years. They ate in silence for a while. Then she said, "You're not what I thought." "No," he agreed. I haven't decided yet if that's better or worse. Fair enough. She looked at him sideways. You're not going to tell me it's better. I'm not going to tell you what to think, he said. You'll figure it out on your own. You seem to prefer it that way. She did. She absolutely did. And the fact that he'd identified that in one conversation was unsettling in a way she didn't have words for yet. She finished her stew. She went upstairs. She turned the new lock on the new door and lay on a bed with a proper frame and a proper mattress and stared at the ceiling of her new life and thought, I have 30 questions and no answers, and I am married to a stranger who just fed me dinner and locked me in safely. And somehow, that is the most confusing thing that has happened to me today. She was asleep inside 10 minutes. Morning came cold and bright, and Amelia woke up before it was fully light. Old habit, ranch habit, the habit of a woman who had learned early that the day did not wait for anyone, and that the best part of it belonged to whoever got up first. She dressed quickly and came downstairs and found Silas already gone. His coffee cup was rinsed and turned upside down on the counter, and his coat was missing from the hook by the door. She went to the window and looked out toward the barn and saw him in the corral, working with a dark bay horse that was putting up considerable argument about whatever was being asked of it. She poured herself coffee from the pot he'd left on the stove, still hot, which meant he hadn't been gone long, and stood at the window and watched. He was good with the horse, not in the showy way of a man who wants to be seen handling an animal, but in the quiet, relentless way of someone who understands that trust is built by showing up the same way every time, until the animal stops waiting for something to go wrong. He didn't fight the horse. He simply stayed, steady and clear, until the horse decided fighting wasn't worth it. She thought about that longer than she meant to. She went outside. He heard her coming, or maybe he'd seen her from the window before she came out, and he called over his shoulder without turning around. "Coffee's on the stove." "I found it." She leaned on the corral fence. "What do you need done today?" He glanced at her then. "You don't have to, Silas." She said his name with a patience she didn't entirely feel. "I am not a woman who stands around watching other people work. What do you need done?" He studied her for a moment. Then he tilted his head toward the east barn. "Farstall has a mare with a stone bruise on her right foreleg. She needs the shoe pulled and the hoof packed. I was going to get to it after the bay, but if you're offering..." "I'm offering." She went and did it. It took her 40 minutes, and it was not comfortable work, and when she came back out, her hands were dirty, and she'd torn a small hole in her riding glove. But the mare was settled, and the hoof was properly packed, and she walked back to the corral feeling, for the first time since Friday morning, like herself. Silas looked at her hands, then at her face. "You've done that before," he said. "More times than I can count. My father's ranch didn't have a farrier on retainer. You did what needed doing." She brushed her palms together. "That mare is going to need to stay off hard ground for a week at minimum." "I know." He was quiet for a second. "Thank you." She nodded once. They went back to work. And that was how the first days settled. Not comfortably, not warmly, but with a working rhythm that was something she hadn't expected and didn't quite know what to do with. They rose early and worked through the morning and met at the kitchen table for midday, without requiring conversation to fill the space between them, and then went back to work. And in the evening there was food, and occasionally a few direct words, and the steady tick of the clock, and the fire, and her book, and his. And none of it was what she had been told a marriage was supposed to look like. And all of it was functional, real, unexpectedly bearable. She was almost disturbed by how bearable it was. On the 5th day, she found the locked room.
It was on the ground floor, set back behind the kitchen, and she would have walked past it a dozen more times if she hadn't noticed the lamplight coming through the crack under the door before sunup, when the rest of the house was dark. She stopped. She stood in the hallway for a full minute, listening. She heard the scratch of a pen, papers being moved, the solid knock of a glass being set down. She knocked twice. Silence. Then, "I'll be out in a minute." She waited. 2 minutes passed. The lamplight disappeared from under the door. Silas came out with a leather folio under one arm and his expression completely neutral. Not guilty, she noted. Not caught. Simply. Composed in a way that was a few degrees more deliberate than his usual composure. "What's in that room?" she asked. "Business records." "What kind of business?" "Land records, mostly. Deeds, survey maps, legal correspondence." He moved past her toward the kitchen, and she followed, because she had learned very quickly that when Silas wanted to keep moving, standing still was less effective than keeping pace with him. "Who is Edmund Hawthorne?" she asked. He stopped. She had found the name in a letter that had blown off the porch table 2 days earlier. She hadn't read the body of the letter, only the signature and a few words at the top before the wind took it again. But the name had lodged in her memory like a splinter, small and sharp. Silas set the folio on the kitchen table. He turned around. "Where did you hear that name?" he said, and his voice had changed in a way she couldn't precisely define. Not anger. Something colder than anger. "A letter," she said. "It blew off the porch. I only saw the name and the first line. Something about a deadline." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the weight of whatever he was deciding. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine standing." "Amelia." Just her name, quietly. "Sit down, please." She sat. He stood across the table from her and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not the steady neutrality she'd gotten used to, but something underneath that. Something that had cost him something to allow to show. "Edmund Hawthorne," he said, "is a land developer out of Chicago. He's been buying up property in this region for 3 years, mostly through legal pressure, debt acquisition, contested inheritance, county tax disputes. He buys the debt, he waits for people to default, and then he moves in." He paused. "He's been trying to acquire this valley for 2 years. Amelia's hands were very still on the table. "And he can't. Not as long as the deed is clean and the owner is present and legally established." Silas looked at her carefully. A single man living alone in the hills is easier to challenge than a settled household. Harder to claim abandonment, harder to argue instability or incoherence of ownership. She stared at him. "You married me to stabilize a land claim?" "I told you I needed a legal partner with standing in this valley." "You told me vague words about people with money and lawyers. You didn't tell me there was a specific man with a specific plan already in motion." "No," he said. "I didn't. Not then." "But you're telling me now." "Yes." "Why now?" His jaw tightened slightly. "Because Hawthorne sent a letter. He's coming to Redstone Valley. He's hired a lawyer to file a formal challenge to the deed, on the grounds that the land was improperly inherited from my grandfather, and that the estate has been functionally abandoned for the past—" He stopped. "He has someone in this county feeding him information. Someone who knows this land exists." The room was very quiet.
How much land? Amelia asked. The valley and the surrounding ridges.
4,200 acres in total. She did not make a sound for a long moment.
4,000. She stopped, started again. Silas, this valley alone is worth—
A great deal. He said it flatly. Yes.
And your grandfather
Settled it in 1847. Built on it. Filed the original deed. Left it to my father. My father left it to me. Every document is in order. His voice was steady, but she could hear what it was being held steady against.
Hawthorne's claim isn't legitimate, but a fraudulent claim filed in the right county court with the right amount of money behind it can cost a man everything, even when he's in the right. And a solitary man with no witnesses, no household, no standing in the local community
is easier to bury, she finished.
Yes.
She breathed out slowly.
How long do we have before he files?
Silas looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Barely, just at the edges, but she caught it. 2 weeks, he said. Maybe 3.
Then we need to be visible. She stood up. We need people in this valley to know this household is real and established. We need your name set alongside mine in town, in the feed store, at the post office, at church if it comes to that. She saw his expression. I know you don't like being visible. I understand exactly why you've been invisible all these years. But you've changed the rules now, Silas. You brought me into this. So here is what's going to happen. We are going to be the most settled, most known, most clearly real married couple in Redstone Valley inside of 2 weeks. And Edmund Hawthorne is going to file his fraudulent claim and find out he is 3 months too late. Silas looked at her for a long, long moment. You're not angry, he said, about what I didn't tell you. I am absolutely furious, she said crisply. I'm dealing with that separately. Right now, we have a problem to solve, and I prefer to be angry after the problem is handled. She picked up her coffee. Tell me everything about the deed. Every document, every name, every date. From the beginning. He sat down. He told her. It took 3 hours, and by the end of it, Amelia's head hurt, and her coffee had gone cold. And she had filled 4 pages of a notepad with names and dates and legal reference points. And she understood with a clarity that made her chest tight exactly what Silas had built his entire isolated existence around protecting. His grandfather, Jonas Boone, had come west in 1847 with nothing but a mule and a surveying kit and the kind of stubborn patience that the frontier rewarded. He had found this valley, this hidden bowl of land behind the ridge, and he had understood immediately what no one else had yet seen, that the creek running through the center of it fed 3 different tributary systems, that the grass was some of the best grazing land in the territory, that the natural ridges on all 4 sides created shelter from the worst winter weather, and that whoever held this land long enough to develop it properly would hold something irreplaceable. He had filed the deed in 1849. He had built the house in 1851. He had raised Silas's father here, and Silas's father had raised Silas here. And when Silas was 19, his father had died of a fever and left him 4,000 acres and a house and a secret that had already by then begun to attract dangerous attention. The first attempt had come when Silas was 23. A speculator from the East, who had somehow gotten hold of the original survey maps, had filed a competing claim, arguing that Jonas Boone's original deed was improperly witnessed. It had taken 2 years and most of the family's liquid savings to defeat the claim in court. The second attempt had come 3 years later. A fire, deliberately set, Silas was certain, though he could never prove it, had destroyed the original cabin and nearly reached the main house. After that,
Silas had made a decision. He would become no one. He would be the shabby mountain hermit that nobody in Redstone Valley had any reason to think about twice.
He would live in the old cabin up the hill. He would let the valley stay hidden. He would wait and watch and protect what was his by being invisible. It had worked. For years, it had worked. Until Edmund Hawthorne. "He's not going to stop," Silas said. "Not after one court challenge." "No," Amelia agreed. "Men like that don't stop." She tapped her pen against the notepad. "Who is his lawyer?" "A man named Trent, Calvin Trent. He works out of Gerald Trent's son." She said it fast and flat. "Calvin Trent grew up 2 valleys over. I've known him since I was 12. He's been in Chicago for 10 years. She looked at Silas with sharp eyes. "He is also the man who represented the bank when my father's note was first written." Silence. "The bank," Silas said slowly. "The note that I cleared." The realization moved through the room like a cold draft. "Hawthorne put your father in debt," Silas said. His voice was very quiet now. "I don't know that," Amelia said carefully. "Not yet. But I know that my father's note was written 18 months ago, and it was Calvin Trent who drew up the terms. And those terms were unusually punishing for a ranch with a solid 30-year history." She set her pen down. "And I know that the moment that note was coming due, a man appeared offering to pay it in exchange for a connection to this land." Silas stood up abruptly. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to her, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the contained force of a man who was putting things together that he should have put together months ago. "He engineered it," Silas said. "He put pressure on your family to create a path to me. Or he found an existing pressure and used it." She kept her voice steady. "Either way, this was not accidental. Hawthorne is not a man who sends lawyers without doing his groundwork first." Silas turned around. His face was harder than she had seen it. Not angry, not afraid, but resolved in a way that had an edge to it. "You understand," he said, "that this is bigger than a land dispute now." "I understand that very clearly." "And you're still—" He stopped. "What?" "You're still here," he said. "Most women would be saddling their horse right now." Amelia looked at him steadily. "I made an agreement," she said. "I said I'd stand beside you when it counted. You told me there'd be a time when it counted." She picked up her pen again. "This appears to be that time." Something shifted in Silas Boone's face then. Quickly, briefly, there and gone. Like a door opening an inch and then catching itself. But she saw it, and she understood that whatever it was not nothing. "We go into town tomorrow," she said, returning to her notepad. "Together. Publicly. We buy supplies from Aldridge's store, and we stay long enough to be seen. We speak to the county registrar's office, and I pull up the historical deed records on my own family's land for cover. It'll look like routine business. And while I'm there, I find out what filing Trent has already submitted, if any. You know the registrar? I know his wife. Which is better?" She looked up. "Do you trust me?" He looked at her for a moment that was a beat too long to be casual. "I'm getting there," he said. It was, she decided, the most honest answer he could have given. She went back to her notes. Outside, the wind had come up off the ridge and the horses in the corral were restless. And somewhere further up the mountain, in the dark stands of timber above the valley rim, a branch cracked loud and sharp. Silas's head turned toward the sound. His hand moved, just slightly, toward the coat he'd hung on the chair back. "What was that?" Amelia asked without looking up. "Wind," he said. But he didn't sit back down. He stood exactly where he was, looking at the window, and his hand stayed exactly where it was. And Amelia heard in the particular quality of his silence something that her skin recognized even before her mind named it. He wasn't sure it was wind. She set her pen down. "Silas?" "It's nothing," he said. And then, a second later, quietly, "Go upstairs." She did not move. "I am not a woman who—" "Amelia," his voice was very low. "Please." She looked at his face. She looked at his hand near the coat. She looked at the window. She picked up her notepad and went upstairs. And she sat at the top of the staircase, out of sight, and listened to the sound of Silas moving carefully through the dark ground floor of that house, checking the latches, checking the locks, as quietly and as methodically as a man who had been doing exactly this, alone, for a very long time. And she sat there, with her notepad and her pen, and the cold weight of everything she'd learned that day pressing against her chest. And she thought about Edmund Hawthorne and Calvin Trent and the engineered ruin of her father's ranch, and the 4,000 acres sleeping in the dark valley outside these walls. And she thought, whoever comes for this land is going to have to come through both of us now. The house settled. The wind dropped. The clock ticked on. Silas came to the bottom of the staircase and looked up. "All clear," he said. "I know," she said. She stood up and went back to her room and turned her lock and lay in the dark with her eyes open, and her mind already building the plan for tomorrow and the day after and every day after that until this was finished. She was Amelia Carter. She had never yet lost a fight that mattered. She didn't intend to start now. They rode into Redstone Valley the next morning side by side, and people noticed. That was the point. Amelia had dressed deliberately, not finely, but solidly, the way a woman dresses when she wants to be taken seriously rather than admired. She sat straight in the saddle, and she nodded to everyone who looked, and she felt the town's attention move over them like water finding the shape of a new obstacle. Silas rode beside her without comment. He had not argued about coming. He had simply saddled his horse and waited by the gate, and when she came out, he looked at her once, that level, reading look she was becoming familiar with, and said nothing, which she was beginning to understand was his version of approval. They tied up in front of Aldridge's general store and went in together, and Thomas Aldridge's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline and stayed there. "Mrs. Boone," he said, trying the name out like a man tasting something unfamiliar. "Mr. Aldridge?" She handed him the supply list she'd written out that morning. "We'll need all of this filled today if you have the stock. And I'll take 2 pounds of the good coffee, not the shelf blend." Thomas looked at the list. He looked at Silas. He looked back at the list. "You're setting up a proper household, then? Up in the hills?" "We've been a proper household since Friday," Amelia said pleasantly. "We just haven't been in to shop yet." Thomas began pulling stock, and Amelia moved through the store with the ease of a woman who had been doing this for her family her entire life. And she talked. To Thomas, to his wife Eleanor, who came out from the back room, to 2 ranchers' wives she knew from church who came in while she was there, and stood in the aisle with their eyes wide and their questions barely contained. She told them nothing they shouldn't know, and everything they needed to. She mentioned the mountain property with a casual pride, the good water, the excellent grazing land, Silas's grandfather's original settlement. She let the 4,000 acres exist in the conversation without naming the number. And she watched the understanding move across Eleanor Aldridge's face like sunrise. By the time she and Silas walked back out, the store was buzzing. "You're good at that," Silas said quietly as they loaded the buckboard. "At what?" "Telling the truth in a way that builds exactly the picture you want." She glanced at him. "I told them nothing that wasn't accurate." "I know.
That's what makes it good." She almost smiled. She didn't let herself. Not yet.
The county registrar's office was on the second floor of the courthouse building, and the man behind the desk was Herbert Clay, 60 years old and meticulous and deeply susceptible to the opinions of his wife, Dorothy, who was Amelia's mother's second cousin, and who had sent a wedding gift, a hand-stitched table runner, that Amelia had found on the front porch 2 days after the ceremony, with a note that said simply, "Good luck, girl. You'll need it and use it." Herbert stood up when she walked in. "Amelia, Mrs. Boone, what Yes, good morning." "Good morning, Herbert." She sat across from his desk without being invited to, the way her mother had always sat in official offices, as if chairs existed for the purpose of being used, and waiting for permission was for people with less to do. "I need to look at the deed history on the Carter family ranch, going back 20 years. Routine verification. We're discussing a potential land consolidation, and I want the records clean before anything moves forward." Herbert nodded rapidly and went to his filing cabinet, and while his back was turned, Amelia's eyes moved across the surface of his desk with the quick precision of a woman who had spent 24 hours thinking about exactly this moment. Third stack from the left, a manila folder with a Chicago postmark visible on the envelope beneath it. The return address was a law firm. She could read the first 3 letters of the name before Herbert turned back around. T-R-E. Trent. Calvin Trent had already filed something. It was sitting on Herbert Clay's desk right now. She kept her face completely still and spent 45 minutes reviewing Carter family deed records she already had memorized. And she asked Herbert 2 careful questions about the process for challenging a historical inheritance claim, framed as hypothetical, framed as something she'd read about in a case from another county. And Herbert answered both in the overly thorough way of a man who likes to demonstrate his expertise, and in doing so, told her, without knowing he'd told her anything at all, exactly what Trent had filed and what the timeline was. 15 days. Trent had filed a formal contest of inheritance 14 days ago, which meant Silas had 1 day left to file a response before the challenge was entered into the court record uncontested. 1 day. She stood up, thanked Herbert, shook his hand, and walked out of that office at a pace that was 3 degrees faster than her entry had been. Silas was waiting in the hall. He looked at her face and straightened. "How bad?" he said. "We have 1 day," she said. "Walk fast." They were back at the buckboard in 4 minutes, and she told him everything, all of it, fast and clean, while he stood with both hands on the side rail and listened without interrupting, which she had noticed was a thing he did. He waited until she was completely finished before he responded, and he never interrupted, and she could not decide if that was patience or control. But either way, it was more useful than most men she'd known who jumped in at the second sentence. 14 days ago, he said when she finished. He filed 14 days ago. The morning after our wedding, Amelia said. That landed between them. He knew about the wedding, Silas said. Or he knew the clock was running on something, and he jumped early. She looked at him directly. Either way, who told him? Who in this valley knew about the deed filing and your grandfather's land, and enough of the details to be useful to a Chicago lawyer? Silas's jaw worked once. He looked down at his hands on the rail. There's one man, he said slowly, an old surveyor, name of Pete Griggs. He did some boundary work for my father years back. He's known about the valley since before I took it over. He paused. He's also been drinking himself to pieces at the saloon for the past 3 years. A man with enough money asking the right questions at the right bar is all it would take, she finished. I never thought he'd... Silas stopped. You trusted him. He worked for my father, and someone offered him more than your father's memory was worth. She kept her voice even, because this was not the moment for anger, and they both knew it.
That's a problem for later. Right now we need a lawyer in the next 2 hours. The only lawyer in this county is Daniel Marsh. Daniel Marsh has been fishing for an excuse to retire for 5 years, and he's terrified of complicated cases. She was already thinking. But he's not the only option.
Porter Webb, in the next county over. He handled the Hendersons' boundary dispute 3 years back, and he won it. He's sharp, and he doesn't scare easy.
That's 40 miles.
I know how far it is. Silas looked at her. You'd ride 40 miles today.
I'd ride 80 if that's what the day required.
She held his gaze.
This is what I'm here for, Silas. This is the standing you said you needed. So let me stand.
Something moved in his face. That same quick door-opening thing she'd seen the morning in the kitchen. And this time it stayed open a half-second longer before he pulled it shut. You're not what I expected either, he said.
I know, she said. Now let's ride.
They rode hard and reached Porter Webb's office in the next valley by early afternoon, and the man himself was in. A broad-shouldered, red-faced lawyer in his 50s, with ink on his hands and a mind like a steel trap. And he listened to everything Silas laid out with the focused stillness of a man calculating odds in real time.
Jonas Boone's original deed is on file in the state records? Webb asked.
Filed 1849. Witnessed by 2 men who were both in the historical census records. Silas had brought the leather folio. He laid the relevant documents on Webb's desk, one at a time, and Amelia watched Webb's expression shift from skeptical attention to something that looked, cautiously, like interest.
And the inheritance transfer from your father to you?
Filed the month he died. I have the original and 2 certified copies. Webb looked at the papers. He looked at Silas. He looked at Amelia.
Your wife dug this up at the registrar's office?
This morning, Amelia said.
In 45 minutes.
Herbert Clay is thorough when he thinks he's teaching, she said. And very easy to direct. Webb studied her for a moment, with the measuring look of a man recalculating something. Then he turned back to Silas. Trent is good, he said. I've seen his work. He's going to argue the inheritance chain is broken based on the gap between your father's death and your refiling. There was a gap, yes? 8 months, Silas said. I was 19. I didn't know the legal process. By the time I found a lawyer to walk me through it, 8 months is enough for Trent to argue functional abandonment if he can pair it with anything else. Webb tapped the desk. He'll have a second argument ready. What's your weakest point? The fire, Silas said. Webb's eyes sharpened. Tell me. Someone set fire to the original cabin on the property 12 years ago. I reported it to the county sheriff at the time. The report is in the records, but it was never investigated. If Trent finds that report, he'll argue the property was damaged, partially abandoned, and the man who set the fire was working for someone, Amelia said. Both men looked at her. Think about it, she said, leaning forward. 12 years ago, someone tries to burn Silas out. 8 years ago, the speculation attempts go quiet. 2 years ago, Hawthorne starts buying up the region. And 14 days ago, the morning after our wedding, Trent files a challenge. She looked at Webb directly. This isn't opportunism. This is a long-running plan. Hawthorne has known about this land for years, and he's been patient, and he's been building a case layer by layer. The fire was meant to create a gap in the property record. It didn't work completely, but it gave him something to use later. Webb was very still. If I can prove that, he said, the challenge doesn't just fail. It exposes Hawthorne to a counterclaim for interference with property rights, going back 12 years.
Which is why, Amelia said, we need the original fire report, and we need Pete Griggs on record
before Hawthorne's people get to him again." Silas turned to look at her. She could feel the weight of his attention on the side of her face. "You had all of this worked out before we walked in here," he said quietly. "I had the shape of it," she said. "Webb just confirmed the angles." She looked at the lawyer. "Can you file a response by tomorrow morning?" "If I start now and work through the night," Webb said. "Then start now," she said. "We'll pay whatever your rate is, and we'll pay it today." Webb stood up and reached for his coat. "Mrs. Boone," he said, "your husband is a lucky man." Silas said nothing, but Amelia felt his hand brush her arm as he reached past her to gather the documents from Webb's desk. Brief, accidental or not, she couldn't say. And the warmth of it stayed on her sleeve for the entire 40-mile ride home. They got back to the valley after dark. The horses were tired, and so were they, and the fire had gone low, and Silas rebuilt it without a word, while Amelia washed her hands and face at the basin and tried to organize the next 48 hours in her head before she was too tired to think clearly. She came out of the kitchen and found him standing at the fireplace with his back to her, both hands on the mantel, looking into the flames, and something in the set of his shoulders stopped her. "Silas?" He didn't turn around. "I want you to know something," he said. She waited. "When I went to your father," he said, I told myself it was strategy, a legal calculation." He paused. "I'd done my research on the Carter family before I went. I knew your history, your reputation, the way the ranch hands talked about you." Another pause. "I knew you were capable. I didn't know you were this." "This," she repeated carefully. "This." He turned around. His face in the firelight was harder to read than usual, which meant he was working less hard at keeping it controlled. "You rode 40 miles and talked a lawyer into working through the night and identified a 12-year conspiracy in a 20-minute meeting. And you did all of it the day after finding out your marriage was built on a foundation I didn't fully disclose to you." "You disclosed the important parts." "I disclosed what I thought you needed to know." He looked at her. "That's not the same thing, and you know it." She was quiet for a moment. "Are there more things I don't know?" "Yes," he said. No hesitation. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. "Will you tell me?" "When the time is right," he said. "Yes." That is still an unsatisfying answer. "I know," he held her gaze. "But I want you to understand that the answer is getting closer to now than it's ever been." She looked at him in the firelight. The strange, careful, infuriatingly private man she had married 6 days ago, and felt the ground beneath her feet shift slightly, the way ground shifts before something new begins to grow. "Go to sleep, Silas," she said. "Tomorrow's going to be worse." He almost smiled. She was almost certain of it. She was right. Tomorrow was worse. She was at the water pump before sunrise when she heard the horses. Not one horse, several, coming up the valley road from the south at a pace that was not casual. She stood very still and counted the sounds. 4 horses, maybe 5. She turned and walked fast to the house and went straight to the ground floor room and knocked hard twice. "Silas! Riders!" He was out in 30 seconds, coat on, rifle in hand, and the look on his face told her he had been sleeping lightly enough to hear them already. They came out onto the porch together. 4 men on horseback, stopping at the edge of the property line. The one in front was not a cowboy. He was dressed in Eastern clothes, a dark suit, a good hat, and he rode with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to arriving somewhere and finding it already his. Edmund Hawthorne. Amelia had never seen him before, and she knew immediately who he was, the way you know a threat that's been described to you in the dark.
When you finally see it in the light, it's both exactly what you expected and worse. He was maybe 50, silver-haired, clean-shaved, well-fed in the way of a man who has not missed a meal in 30 years. He looked at the house with the expression of someone who has driven past a property a dozen times and has finally decided to stop and knock. He did not look at Silas. He looked at Amelia. "Well," he said pleasantly. "The new wife," he smiled. "I was wondering when I'd get a chance to meet you, Mrs. Boone." Amelia stepped forward to the edge of the porch and put her hands at her sides and looked at him with the same calm steadiness she had used on difficult men her entire life. Bankers, creditors, hired hands who thought a woman alone was an opportunity. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, "you're on private property."
The deed to which was filed this morning in the state court record, with a full legal response to your fraudulent challenge by Porter Webb of the next county, who is, as I understand it, a personal friend of the circuit court judge. Hawthorne's smile stayed in place, but his eyes changed, just slightly, just enough. "I'm only here for a conversation," he said. "You brought 3 armed men for a conversation," she said. "Just a precaution." "You should precaution yourself off this property," she said, "before I precaution you myself." Silas made a sound beside her, short, low, quickly controlled. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Hawthorne. The man studied her for a moment with an expression that was not quite admiration and not quite contempt. Something in between, the look of a chess player reassessing the board. "You've made this more complicated," he said, and there was no more pleasantness in his voice now, just the flat assessment of a man who has decided to drop the performance. "I intend to make it considerably more complicated," Amelia said, "and I intend to start with a deposition from a man named Pete Griggs and a 12-year-old fire report that connects your operation to an arson on this property. So when you get back to town, Mr. Hawthorne, you tell Calvin Trent that the Boone family's legal position is not a cabin in the hills and a solitary man with no community. It is 4,000 acres with a clean deed, a lawyer with a circuit court connection, and a wife who grew up in this valley and knows every rancher, registrar, and county official in it by name." Hawthorne looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Silas for the first time. "You did well," he said, and it was unclear whether he was speaking to Silas about the land or about her. And the ambiguity was, she suspected, entirely deliberate. He turned his horse. His men turned with him. They rode back down the valley road the way they'd come, and the sound of their horses faded slowly into the morning. Silas stood on the porch beside her, and neither of them moved until the sound was completely gone. Then he said, quietly, "Pete Griggs." "We need to reach him today," she said, "before Hawthorne does." "I know where he drinks." "Then let's go get him before he's had enough to be useless." She was already turning toward the door. "We'll need Webb to be present for any deposition. Send a rider." "Amelia." She stopped. His voice had been different, quieter. She turned around. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Open, unguarded, stripped of the careful control that was his constant and habitual armor. And for just a moment, he was not the unknowable man she'd ridden north with a week ago. He was simply a man, standing on his own porch, in the middle of a fight he'd been carrying alone for 12 years. "Thank you," he said. It was 2 words, and it cost him something to say them, and she knew it. She looked at him for one steady moment. "Don't thank me," she said. "Win." She went inside to get her coat. Pete Griggs was exactly where Silas said he'd be. The back corner of the Redstone Saloon, 3rd stool from the wall, with a glass in front of him that had been refilled enough times that morning to make his eyes slow and his hands unsteady. He was a thin man, 60-something, with a surveyor's permanent squint
and the particular look of someone who has been carrying guilt long enough that it had started to eat through the floor of him. He saw Silas walk in and went white. Silas crossed the room without hurrying and sat down across from him and said nothing for a moment, just looked. And Amelia, coming in 2 steps behind, watched Pete Griggs wilt under that steady gaze like a man waiting for a verdict he'd already written himself.
"Silas," Pete started, "I want you to know, I never thought it would go this far. He told me he just wanted information about the survey boundaries. He said it was for a regional land map. He paid me $30 and I swear to God I didn't know he was going to—"
"How much in total?" Silas said quietly. Pete's mouth closed. "How much did he pay you?" Silas said, "across however many times he came back?"
Silence. $240, Pete said. His voice had dropped to almost nothing. "Over 2 years. He kept coming back with more questions, and I kept—" He stopped, looked at the table. "I knew your father. I worked that land. I knew exactly what I was doing, and I told myself it was just maps, and I was lying, and I knew I was lying." He looked up. His eyes were wet, and it had nothing to do with the whiskey. "I'm sorry, Silas. That's all I've got left that's worth anything." Silas looked at him for a long moment. "I don't need your sorry," he said. "I need your signature on a legal deposition. Today, in front of a lawyer. Everything you told Hawthorne, every question he asked, every time he came back, every dollar. All of it." Pete stared at him. "If I sign that, Hawthorne's people will—" "Hawthorne's people," Amelia said from behind Silas, "are going to be considerably occupied with their own problems once that deposition is filed. You sign today, Pete. You tell the truth today, and whatever comes after that, you'll face it standing up instead of sitting here." Pete looked at her. He looked at Silas. He looked at his glass. He pushed the glass away. "All right," he said. "All right. Get your lawyer." Porter Webb arrived by mid-afternoon, having ridden hard from the next valley on the back of a horse that was clearly not accustomed to urgency. He sat up at the table in the back of the saloon. The owner, a pragmatic man named Cal, who had known Silas for years and asked no unnecessary questions, cleared the space without being asked. And for 2 hours, Webb took Pete Griggs through every conversation, every payment, every piece of information he had passed to Hawthorne or Trent or any of their people. It was worse than Amelia had expected. Hawthorne had been working the region for nearly 5 years, not 2. He had approached Pete Griggs first, then a retired county surveyor in the neighboring valley, then a former clerk at the state land office who had since moved to Denver, but who had, apparently, been willing to sell access to historical deed records for the right price. He had built a map, not just of Silas's land, but of the entire region's ownership vulnerabilities, and he had been patient and systematic and deeply thorough. The fire 12 years ago had been ordered directly. Pete hadn't known that part himself, but he'd heard Hawthorne reference it in passing during their 3rd meeting, casually, the way a man mentions a decision that is already old history to him. He'd said, "The fire didn't clean the record the way we hoped, but it'll serve as supporting evidence when the time comes." Webb stopped writing when Pete said that. He looked at Silas. "He admitted to arson in front of a witness?" Webb said. "In passing," Pete said quickly. "He didn't say it directly, he said—" "He said enough," Webb said. "And you heard it. And you're going to say exactly those words, exactly that way, in your deposition." He looked at Silas again, and this time the expression on his face was something between professional satisfaction and genuine disbelief. "Boone, this isn't just a land dispute anymore. This is criminal conspiracy, arson, witness corruption, potentially fraud on the state land records. Silas's face was very still. What does that mean for the challenge Trent filed? It means that challenge is the least of Hawthorne's problems, Webb said. It means that when I walk into that circuit court with this deposition and the fire report and the evidence of systematic deed record access through a corrupted state clerk, I'm not just defending your title. I'm filing charges. The room was quiet. Pete Griggs put his head in his hands. Amelia looked at Silas. He was looking at the table. His jaw was tight, and his hands were flat on the surface, and she could see, for the first time since she'd known him, the full weight of what 12 years of carrying this alone had done to him. Not broken him, nothing like broken, but carved him down to something harder and narrower than he should have been. A man who had learned to make himself smaller, so that the thing he was protecting could survive. She put her hand on the table beside his, not on top of it, just beside it. He looked down at her hand, then up at her. She said nothing. Neither did he. Webb kept writing. They filed the deposition the following morning. Herbert Clay at the registrar's office received the documents with the expression of a man who has suddenly realized the quiet paperwork on his desk has been sitting on top of a fire. He processed everything quickly and correctly and said almost nothing, which Amelia respected. By noon, word was moving through Redstone Valley the way word always moved through small towns. Faster than telegraph, more detailed than newspaper, and only partially accurate, which was fine because the parts that were accurate were damaging enough. Edmund Hawthorne had been making inquiries at the hotel. He'd taken 2 rooms and had been seen meeting with Calvin Trent in the hotel dining room on 2 consecutive evenings. When the deposition was filed, one of those rooms was vacated by mid-afternoon. Trent had gone. Hawthorne stayed. That was the part that kept Amelia's mind working through the second night, lying in a room with the window cracked and the cold mountain air moving through the curtain. Trent's departure made sense. A lawyer who sees his client's case collapse underneath a criminal conspiracy charge takes his license and runs. But Hawthorne's staying meant either extraordinary arrogance or a second plan she hadn't identified yet. She went over everything she knew. The deed, the arson, Griggs, Trent, the state land records, the 5 years of preparation. And then, 2 hours before dawn, in the particular clarity that comes from exhaustion hitting a clean surface, she saw it. She got up and went downstairs. Silas was in the kitchen. He had not been to bed. He was sitting at the table with the leather folio open and a lamp burning and the expression of a man who had been sitting very still for a long time, thinking hard about something difficult. He looked up when she came in.
Hawthorne didn't just buy Griggs, she said, and he didn't just access the state deed records. Those are moves you make when you're building a case. She sat down across from him. What do you do when the case fails? Silas looked at her steadily. You go after the man directly, he said. Not Hawthorne's style. Too exposed. She shook her head. You go after something the man can't replace. Something that, if you take it, makes the land worthless to him, or the fight too costly to continue. She looked at him. What is it that you cannot lose? Not the land, not the deed. Something else. His eyes changed. The water rights, he said. She felt the bottom drop out of the room. The creek that ran through the valley floor, Jonas Boone's Creek, the tributary system her grandfather had identified as the source of the land's real value, had never been separately filed. It was assumed to be part of the original settlement deed, but water rights in Montana Territory were a separate legal category, and if someone had quietly filed a competing claim on the water source before or during the land challenge, "Has anyone filed on the creek?" she said. Silas was already standing.
already pulling papers from the folio. "I don't know," he said. "I never thought to." He stopped. His hands went still on a document. "My grandfather's original deed references the land boundaries, but the creek is only mentioned as a natural landmark, not as a separately claimed water right. I assumed, when was water rights filing made mandatory in this territory?" she asked. "I don't know exactly. Webb will know." She was already thinking forward. If Hawthorne filed a water rights claim in the last 2 years, even a fraudulent one, and it's been sitting in the territorial records unchallenged, he can argue that the land without water access is worthless for ranching, Silas said. "I can't sustain cattle operations without that creek. I can't develop the valley. I can't support neighboring ranchers with water access the way I've been planning." He looked at her, and the control on his face was fully gone now, replaced by the raw focus of a man who has just understood where the knife was aimed all along. He didn't need to win the land challenge. He just needed to run it long enough for the water claim to solidify. "And you'd either sell to him or the land becomes a beautiful, empty box," she finished. They stood there for 3 seconds. Then both of them moved at once. She for her coat, he for the door. And he was faster, but he held the door for her, and they went out into the dark together.
Webb was not pleased about being woken before dawn, but he was a good lawyer, which meant he was awake and dressed and fully concentrated inside of 7 minutes. And when Silas laid out the water rights question, he went straight for his territorial law reference without needing to be asked. Mandatory separate filing for water rights on settled land was enacted in 1878, he said, reading. Prior to that, it was considered appurtenant, attached to the land deed automatically. He looked up. Your grandfather's deed was filed in 1849. Your father's inheritance transfer was 1866. Both predate the 1878 mandate. So the water rights are attached to the deed, Amelia said. They should be. But the 1878 Act included a provision requiring existing landowners to file a formal water rights confirmation within 5 years, by 1883. He looked at Silas. Did you file a confirmation? Silas's silence was its own answer. Webb closed the book. He opened it again. He was quiet for a long moment. If you didn't file by 1883, and someone else filed a claim on that water source after that date, how do we find out if Hawthorne filed? Amelia said. Territorial Water Rights Office in Helena. Webb looked at the clock on his wall. Opens at 8. I can send a telegraph this morning requesting a record search. He paused. But if he filed, Mrs. Boone, the challenge is considerably more complex than what we've been working with. How complex? Silas said. Complex enough that winning it requires more than good documents and a cooperative witness, Webb said carefully. It requires either a court ruling that the 1878 provision doesn't apply to pre-statehood settlements, which is an argument that has merit but has never been tested in this territory, or it requires proving that Hawthorne's filing was fraudulent, which is possible if he knew about your deed and filed anyway, but difficult to establish without direct evidence of intent. Amelia was quiet for a moment. She was adding it up. Send the telegraph, she said. We need to know what we're dealing with before we can decide how to fight it. She looked at Silas. And while we wait for the answer, I need to talk to my father. Both men looked at her. Your father, Silas said carefully. Hector Carter has been ranching in this valley for 40 years, she said. He knows every water source, every filing, every man who ever touched a surveyor's kit in this county. And more than that, she paused, and when she said the next part, her voice was level, but there was something underneath it. Something she had been carrying since the moment she'd understood that Calvin Trent had written her father's banknote. If Hawthorne used my family to get to you, my father deserves to know it,
and I am not going to keep that from him." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "He's going to be furious." "He is going to be absolutely furious," she agreed. "And then he is going to help us."
Hector Carter opened the door of the ranch house and looked at his daughter, and then at the man standing beside her. And something in his face rearranged itself in a way that was not comfortable to witness. The face of a man realizing that the full shape of something is larger and darker than what he'd been told. They sat at the same table where he'd told her about Silas's offer. Ruth brought coffee and stayed this time, and Amelia laid out everything from the beginning. Hawthorne, Trent, the 5-year strategy, the engineered debt, the fire, the water rights question. And she did it plainly and completely, the way you tell someone difficult truth when you respect them enough not to soften it. When she finished, Hector sat very still. "Trent wrote my note," he said. "Yes." "He wrote terms that were designed to break us." "We believe so." Her father put both hands flat on the table and breathed out slowly through his nose. Ruth reached over and put her hand on his arm, and he didn't pull away from it, which told Amelia more about how hard he'd been hit than anything else would have. "I thought the bank was just banks being banks," he said. His voice was low and rough. "I thought it was bad luck and bad timing, and He stopped. "I made you marry a man you'd never met, to fix a problem that someone built deliberately." "You made a decision with the information you had," Amelia said. "That's all any of us can do." He looked at her. His eyes were red at the corners. "Are you all right?" he said. "Not the land, not the legal business. Are you all right?" She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true, and she had not yet said it out loud to anyone, "Better than I expected to be." Hector looked at Silas for the first time since they'd sat down. It was a long, assessing look. The look of a father recalibrating, which is a particular kind of honesty. "You should have told her everything from the start," he said. "Yes," Silas said. "I know that now." "You're telling her everything now?" "Everything I know, as fast as I know it." Hector was quiet for another moment. Then he straightened in his chair, and the grief and anger in his face settled into something harder and more useful. "Water rights," he said. "Griggs did survey work in this valley 20 years ago. If Hawthorne was using his information, he'd know about the creek system." He thought for a moment. "There's an old-timer named August Cole. He filed water rights on his northeast pasture back in 1881. I witnessed the document. He had a surveyor from Helena do the filing. I remember because I asked about doing the same for the South Creek, and the surveyor told me that pre-statehood deeds had automatic appurtenance, and I'd be wasting money." He looked at Silas. He said it specific. He said land deeded before 1870, with a water source named in the boundary description, had continuous rights by territorial precedent. "Your grandfather's deed mentions the creek by name?" "By name and by course," Silas said. He leaned forward. "Jonas Boone Creek. My grandfather named it himself when he filed." Hector looked at Amelia. "That's surveyor's name," she said. "Hammond. Arthur Hammond." Hector stood up. "He retired to Miles City. But if he's still alive and he remembers that conversation, that's your precedent testimony." Amelia was on her feet before he finished the sentence. It took 3 days. 3 days of telegraphs and fast riders, and Webb working through 2 consecutive nights, and Amelia and Silas riding hard across 3 counties, and Hector Carter calling in 40 years of favors from ranchers and registrars, and one retired surveyor who was alive and sharp and remembered every land filing he had ever touched, because, as Arthur Hammond said when they sat across from him in Miles City, a man who forgets his surveys might as well have never done them. Hawthorne had filed a water rights claim. Webb's telegraph confirmed it, filed 14 months ago.
2 months after Trent had begun building the deed challenge. It was fraudulent. Not subtly fraudulent. Hawthorne had listed the creek under a different survey name, deliberately obscuring its connection to the Boone deed. It was the kind of filing that passes through a busy territorial office without scrutiny, but collapses the moment someone with the right knowledge looks directly at it.
Arthur Hammond looked directly at it. "That creek has been Jonas Boone's creek since 1849, he said, looking at the filing with the contempt of a man watching someone lie about something he witnessed personally. "I surveyed the tributary connections in 1873. The naming and the boundaries are in my own records." He signed 3 separate affidavits without being asked twice. Webb filed everything simultaneously: the criminal conspiracy charges, the fraudulent water rights challenge, the arson evidence from Pete Griggs, and the Hammond affidavits establishing continuous water rights under territorial precedent. On a Thursday morning in the circuit court. By Thursday afternoon, the circuit judge, who was, as Webb had mentioned, a personal friend, had issued a temporary injunction freezing all of Hawthorne's property claims in the territory pending investigation. By Thursday evening, Edmund Hawthorne had checked out of the Redstone Valley Hotel.
Calvin Trent had already been gone for a week. Silas heard about Hawthorne's departure from Thomas Aldridge, who had heard it from the hotel keeper, who had watched 2 men load trunks onto an eastbound coach with the particular efficiency of people who have decided a place is no longer worth their time. He was standing in the front room of the house when he got the news, and Amelia was at the long oak table going through Webb's most recent correspondence. And he stood there for a moment after the rider left, and she looked up from the papers and read something in the set of his shoulders that she had learned, over 3 weeks, to translate. "He's gone," she said. "He's gone," Silas confirmed. She set down the paper she was holding. She looked at him carefully. "How do you feel?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Like I've been holding a door closed against a storm for 12 years, he said. "And someone finally told me the storm has moved on." "But you're not sure you believe it yet." He looked at her. "No," he said. "Not yet." She understood that. She understood it in her bones. "Webb says the criminal charges will take months to process fully," she said. "Hawthorne isn't finished as a legal matter. He's just finished here." "I know. And there may be others, people who knew about this land." "I know that too." She stood up and came around the table and stood in front of him, and she looked at him the way she'd been looking at everything in her new life, directly, without flinching, with the particular clarity of a woman who has learned that the truth, however difficult, is always better company than a comfortable uncertainty. "Then what we've done," she said, "is buy time, real time. Time to build something here that is so established and so visible and so woven into this valley that the next person who tries this finds a wall instead of a door." He was looking at her with that open expression she had first seen on the porch the morning Hawthorne rode away. Unguarded, present. The expression of a man who has been alone for so long that the presence of someone who simply stays is something he does not yet know how to accommodate. "Why are you still here?" he said. She blinked. "What?" "You could have left." His voice was quiet and completely serious. "Twice in the last 3 weeks you had clean cause. The moment I told you about Hawthorne. The moment you found out about the water rights. A woman who came into this as a legal arrangement and nothing more. She had every right to say, 'This is too much. This is not what I agreed to. I'm done.'" Amelia looked at him steadily. "You're asking me why I didn't quit?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, and when she answered the way she had answered everything in the weeks since riding north through the hills. Directly, without softening,
Because he had always responded better to the plain truth than to anything else. Because quitting things I've started has never been something I do, she said. Because this valley is worth fighting for, and I don't walk away from things worth fighting for. Because... She stopped, started again. Because somewhere in the last 3 weeks, Silas, this stopped being an arrangement to me. The room was very quiet. He looked at her. She looked at him. Amelia, he started. Don't say something careful, she said. I have had enough careful from you to last a considerable time. He almost laughed. She could see it. The laugh he pulled back. And somehow that was more intimate than anything else had been. I'm not very good at this, he said. At the other parts. The parts that aren't strategy and legal filings and keeping the land safe. I know, she said. I've noticed. I'm telling you because I don't want you to expect... Silas. She said it the way she said it when he was about to say something she was going to have to argue against. I did not ride 40 miles in a day and take depositions and dig up a retired surveyor in Miles City because I was honoring a legal arrangement. Stop explaining yourself and start trusting me. He looked at her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he reached out, slowly, deliberately, with the same careful intention he put into every movement, and put his hand against her face. And she did not step back. And the fire was burning low in the stone hearth, and the clock was ticking. And somewhere outside the valley, the last of the day was fading out of the sky. I do trust you, he said. That's what I've been trying to say. Every clumsy word of it. She turned her face slightly into his hand. I know, she said, softer than she'd meant it to come out. I know, Silas. They stood there in the quiet of the house they were building together, and neither of them said anything more. And it was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Hawthorne left. It came through Webb's office, forwarded with a note in the lawyer's handwriting that said simply, "You need to read this before anyone else does. Come today if you can." Silas read Webb's note at the breakfast table and said nothing. But he pushed back his chair and reached for his coat in one motion, and Amelia looked at his face and left her coffee where it was. They rode to Webb's office together. The letter was from a law firm in Chicago. Not Trent's firm, a different one, larger, with 5 names on the letterhead, and the kind of heavy cream paper that announced money before you read a single word. Webb had it laid flat on his desk, with his hands folded on top of it when they walked in, which told her, before she sat down, that whatever was in it required a moment of preparation. "Read it," she said. Webb slid it across. Silas read it first, then handed it to her without expression, which was its own kind of warning. The letter was from Edmund Hawthorne's primary legal counsel in Chicago. It informed them, in the measured language of people who had been paid a great deal of money to remain calm, that Mr. Hawthorne was prepared to withdraw all filed claims, drop all pending legal challenges, and cease all activity in the Montana Territory, in exchange for a private settlement. No admission of wrongdoing, no criminal proceedings pursued. A sum of money to be paid to the Boone household for, and this was the phrase that made Amelia's jaw tighten, inconvenience caused during a period of legitimate business inquiry. Inconvenience. 12 years of living like a ghost. A fire, corrupted records, an engineered ruin of her father's ranch. 2 families used like instruments. And Hawthorne's lawyers were calling it inconvenience. She set the letter down. "He's scared," she said. "He should be," Webb said. The criminal charges are moving. The territorial court is not friendly to outside money right now. There have been 2 other cases this year involving Eastern speculators, and the judges are tired of it. Hawthorne's lawyers know that if this goes to full trial, he doesn't just lose the land claim. He faces criminal conspiracy charges in a territory that is actively looking for examples to set. Webb leaned back. This settlement offer is not generosity. It's a man trying to get out of a burning building before the roof comes down. So we say no, Silas said. Amelia looked at him. We say no, she agreed. But we say it in a way that costs him more than the refusal. Both men looked at her. He wants no admission of wrongdoing, she said. That means he is terrified of the public record. The criminal charges, if they go to trial, become public record.
Every detail, the arson, the corrupted state clerk, the engineered debt on my father's ranch, all of it becomes a matter of open court record. She picked up the letter and held it level. We decline the settlement. We decline it in writing, through Webb, and we make clear that we intend to pursue every charge to full resolution. And then we contact the other families in this region who have lost land or been pressured in the last 5 years, because I will bet my saddle that we are not the only ones. The room was quiet. There are 2 other families, Silas said slowly. The Harmons lost their north pasture 18 months ago through a tax dispute I never fully believed. And the widow Price sold her water rights 2 years ago. She said she needed the money, but she was barely 50, and her land was solid. I never connected them to Hawthorne. Because he was careful to keep each case isolated, Amelia said. But they're not isolated anymore. They're part of a pattern. She looked at Webb. If we can connect their losses to the same operation, Hawthorne isn't facing 1 criminal conspiracy charge. He's facing 3. Webb picked up his pen. I'll need to speak to both families, he said. This week, if possible. I'll ride to the Harmons tomorrow, Amelia said. I know Margaret Harmon from the Women's Guild. She'll talk to me. Silas was looking at her with that particular expression she had come to know well over the past weeks. The one that was not quite surprise and not quite admiration, but something in between that he had not yet found the right word for. You planned this before we walked in here, he said. I planned it halfway here, she said. I finished it while Webb was talking. She looked at him steadily. Do you trust me? Completely, he said. It came out without hesitation. No pause, no qualification, no 3-beat delay while he decided how much to allow himself to say. Just completely. She held his gaze for 1 moment. Then she turned back to Webb. Write the refusal, she said. Make it clean and make it final. 3. Margaret Harmon was a broad-shouldered woman of 55 who had spent 30 years ranching beside her husband before he died and had spent the 5 years since proving, in her own quiet way, that the ranch had not died with him. She opened her door when Amelia knocked, looked at her for 1 second and said, I heard you married Silas Boone. Come in. She listened to everything Amelia laid out with a stillness that Amelia recognized, the stillness of a woman who has been waiting for someone to say out loud the thing she already knew but couldn't prove. When Amelia finished, Margaret set down her coffee cup with a precision that suggested controlled force. Calvin Trent, she said. You know the name? He's the one who filed the tax challenge on my north pasture. Her voice was flat and hard. He told me the county assessment had been miscalculated for 7 years, and I owed back taxes I couldn't verify and couldn't afford to fight. He had a buyer ready the same week. She paused. I thought it was just a man taking advantage of a widow. Another pause. Colder. It was coordinated. From the beginning, Amelia said. You weren't a target of opportunity. You were a planned acquisition.
Margaret looked at the table for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were clear and steady, and carrying the kind of fury that has been cold stored for a long time and is not diminished by it. "What do you need from me?" "Everything you have," Amelia said. "Every document, every letter, every name, and a signed statement." "I'll have it ready by morning," Margaret said. "And I want to be in that courtroom when it's done."
The widow Price, whose name was Clara, and who was not frail or finished in the way that the word widow often implied, said 3 words when Amelia appeared at her door and explained why she'd come.
"I knew it," she said. She had kept every document, filed in a wooden box under her kitchen floorboard with the exact, meticulous attention of a woman who had not fully believed the transaction was legitimate, but had been too alone and too pressured to fight it in the moment. She handed the box to Amelia with both hands and said, "Bring me justice, or bring me back that box, because one way or another, I am not letting this end quietly." Amelia carried that box back to Webb's office and set it on his desk and watched his expression shift as he went through it, and the sound he made was short and low and utterly satisfied. "Clara Price's water rights were filed under the same survey identification number as Hawthorne's false claim on your creek," he said. He looked up. "He ran the same play twice. He just used different names." "He thought no one was connecting the cases," Amelia said. "No one was," Webb said, "until now." He filed the expanded charges 4 days later. 3 families, 1 coordinated operation. 5 years of documented evidence that now filled a leather case so thick Webb had to use a second buckle to close it. The circuit court judge set a hearing date within the week.
The hearing was not a quiet affair. Word had moved through the valley the way it always did, fast, specific, only partially restrained. And when the circuit court convened on that Thursday morning, the gallery was full. Margaret Harmon sat in the 3rd row with her hands folded and her jaw set. Clara Price sat beside her with the wooden box on her lap. Pete Griggs sat near the back in a suit that had been recently pressed and wore the face of a man trying to pay a debt in the only currency he had left. Hector Carter was in the 2nd row with Ruth beside him, and when Amelia came in, he caught her eye and gave her a single nod, firm and clean, the way he had always communicated things that mattered. Silas sat beside Amelia at the respondents' table. He had dressed carefully, and the clothes he wore were the clothes of the man he actually was, not the mountain hermit's worn coat and patched saddle, but a man of substance and standing and deep roots in this land. He sat straight and still, and when the judge called the session to order, he looked forward without looking around, and Amelia, who knew his face by now the way you learn a language you use every day, could see the particular tension in him that was not fear but something older, the culmination of 12 years of holding, 12 years of waiting, arriving at last at the place where holding and waiting became something else. She put her hand on the table beside his. He turned his palm over and held it. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Webb presented everything with the calm precision of a man who knows his case is clean and has no need for theater. The deed history, the arson evidence, Pete Griggs's deposition, which Pete delivered from the witness chair with his hands shaking and his voice steady, because whatever else he was trying. The Hammond affidavits, Margaret Harmon's documents, Clara Price's box. The survey identification number that appeared in both the False Creek claim and the Price water rights transaction. The same number, filed by the same hand, proving coordination that Hawthorne's Chicago lawyers tried to characterize as clerical error and failed, visibly, to make convincing. Hawthorne's legal team had sent 2 men from Chicago. They were good lawyers. They were not good enough. The judge issued his ruling before the end of the session.
Edmund Hawthorne's deed challenge was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled. His fraudulent water rights claim was vacated. The criminal conspiracy charges were referred to the territorial prosecutor with the judge's personal recommendation for full investigation. And the court formally entered into the record the continuous, uncontested ownership of the Boone Valley estate, 4,200 acres, Jonas Boone's Creek included, under the name of Silas Boone and his wife Amelia. Both names in the record. The gallery did not erupt. These were ranch people, Montana people, people who expressed things with a handshake and a nod and a brief, hard press of the jaw. But the sound that moved through that room was real. A collective exhale, a low murmur of satisfaction. The sound of a community recognizing that something that had been wrong for a long time had just been corrected. Silas sat very still for a moment after the gavel came down. Then he turned to Amelia. She was looking at him already. "It's done," she said. He looked at her. This man who had lived alone for 12 years, protecting something that was worth protecting. This man who had knocked on a rancher's door with an offer that looked strange from the outside and made perfect sense from where he was standing. This man who had fed her venison stew on her wedding night and changed the lock on her door and told her the truth in pieces as fast as he could trust himself to. And what was on his face was not triumph. It was something quieter and more lasting. Relief. Real, bone-deep relief. The kind that comes after a long cold, and the first morning the air is warm. "It's done," he said. 3 months later, the valley was different. Not in its bones. The land was the same land Jonas Boone had settled in 1847. The same creek ran its same course through the center. The same ridges held the same sky above. But the valley was alive now, in a way it had not been before. The water systems that Silas had always planned to develop were underway, and 2 neighboring ranching families had entered agreements to access the creek through the property in exchange for partnership in a shared grazing cooperative that Amelia had designed and Webb had drawn up legally. The Harmon Ranch had regained its north pasture through a court order that was a direct consequence of the expanded charges. Clara Price had not gotten her water rights back. The territorial process was slow. But Webb had a clear case and a committed judge, and she was coming to dinner on Sunday, which had become a weekly occurrence that none of them had planned, and all of them had come to count on. Hector Carter rode up the valley every Thursday. He and Silas had a working relationship that had grown from cautious, mutual assessment into something that looked, from the outside, like respect, and from the inside, Amelia suspected, like the beginning of something that both men were too unsentimental to name, but that both of them were quietly grateful for. Ruth had come up once and stayed a week, and left with the particular brightness of a young woman who has seen something she hadn't known was possible, and is now rearranging her understanding of what her own life might look like. And Amelia and Silas had built, in the months since the hearing, the thing they had both been circling since the first morning she'd fixed a stone bruise in the far stall, and come back with dirty hands, and told him the mare needed a week on soft ground. Not a performance of partnership. Not a legal arrangement maintaining its terms. Something that had grown in the spaces between hard work and honest words, and the particular intimacy of 2 people who have fought for the same thing long enough that they have stopped being separate and become something else. It wasn't without difficulty. Silas was still a man of few words in rooms full of people, still more comfortable with a problem he could solve than a feeling he couldn't quite name. Amelia was still sharper-tongued than the situation sometimes required, and still tended to be 3 steps ahead of the conversation, which occasionally meant she had to double back and explain her reasoning to a man who deserved to hear it. They disagreed sometimes, argued occasionally, went to bed on 2 nights with things unresolved, and woke up the next morning and resolved them, because neither of them had learned how to let important things stay broken. They were, in other words, real.
On the evening 3 months after the court ruling, they rode up to the long ridge at the north end of the valley, the ridge Amelia had sat on the night Silas first brought her to the house, when she had looked down at something she didn't understand and felt the entire shape of her new life become unrecognizable. She understood it now, every acre of it. They stopped at the ridge and sat on their horses and looked out over the valley below. The house with its lit windows, the barn, the creek catching the last of the evening light, the wide, dark meadow that would be good cattle ground by spring, the ridges holding it all in their long arms like something worth keeping safe. Silas was quiet for a moment, in the way she had come to know. Not empty quiet, but full quiet. The quiet of a man choosing words the way he chose everything, with intention. "My grandfather stood on this ridge," he said, "the night he decided to file the deed." He wrote about it in a letter to his wife. She was still back east, waiting to come out. He said he stood here and looked down at the valley and thought, "This is the kind of land a man should be willing to build his whole life on." Amelia looked out at the valley. "He was right," she said. "He also said," Silas continued, and there was something in his voice that was careful and deliberate, and not his usual directness, but something more exposed, that the hardest part about finding the right land was knowing you shouldn't try to hold it alone. He paused. "It took me a lot longer to understand that part than it should have." She looked at him. He was looking at her. "I know," she said quietly. "You understand it now." "Because of you," he said. "No qualification, no careful hedge, just because of you." She looked at this man she had married out of necessity and stayed beside out of choice. This complicated, private, deeply loyal man who had protected 4,000 acres for 12 years with nothing but silence and stubborn will and the kind of love for something that looks, from the outside, like stubbornness, but is actually just a refusal to let the wrong people win. And she thought about the morning her father had slid that bank letter across the breakfast table with shame in his eyes, and the side lot where she'd looked down from her horse at a man loading crates and felt the first unwanted flicker of curiosity, and the cold cabin on the hill and the venison stew and the locked door and the 40-mile ride and Pete Griggs's wet eyes and Hawthorne's face when she'd stood on the porch and told him to leave, and Webb's satisfied sound when he opened Clara Price's box, and the gavel coming down, and Silas's palm turning over in hers. And she thought, "I rode north believing I had traded my future for my family's survival. I had no idea I was riding toward the best decision of my life." "Funny," she said. He looked at her. "What?" "I thought I was forced to marry the poorest cowboy in Montana." The corner of his mouth moved, that almost smile she had spent months learning to read. And instead? She looked out over the valley that was theirs, earned, fought for, legally recorded, and deeply real, and she felt the truth of it settle into her chest like something that had been searching for the right place to land and had finally, completely, arrived. "Instead," she said, "I married the only man in this territory rich enough in every way that mattered to give me a life worth building." Silas reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. He held it the way he did everything, without performance, without excess, with a steadiness that had not wavered once since the morning she'd first seen it and understood, too late to be warned by the understanding, that steadiness like that is the most dangerous kind of thing, the kind you build your life around. The valley spread below them, wide and sheltered and alive, held safe by the ridges on all sides, the creek running clear through the center, the house standing solid at the far end, where Jonas Boone had put his roots in 1847,
and every Boone since had kept them there. And on that ridge, in the last of the Montana evening, Amelia Carter Boone understood something her mother had tried to tell her once, and she had been too young to hear. That the bravest thing a strong woman can do is recognize the man who is strong enough to stand beside her, not in front, not behind, but exactly beside, and choose him, fully, without condition.
She had been forced into this marriage with nothing but fear and obligation in her hands. She was staying in it with everything she had. And that, in the end, in the long, honest light of everything that had happened, was the only choice that had ever been entirely, completely, and without question, her own.